A Soviet Union's B-59 submarine in the Caribbean Sea was only a few kilometers away from the United States. Concealed beneath the water and fully prepared to attack, the US Navy then became aware of the submarine's presence and attempted to surface it by deploying sonar technology. Small buoys bobbed beneath the water as the Soviet submarine lost contact with the head cutter thousands of kilometers away. The ship's captain believed that perhaps a significant war had just broken out and it was now the appropriate moment to authorize firing the nuclear torpedo missiles. It had come to that time when tensions between the US and the Soviet Union had escalated beyond limits, and thousands of nuclear missiles of both countries were just a button press away. The Soviet submarine's captain was about to press the nuclear missile button when suddenly something happened, which saved the world from destruction. The incident occurred during those 12 days when the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union was spiraling out of control. It was like during World War II, the whole world saw the side effects of nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also witnessed America's dangerous nature. If anyone could challenge America's power, it was the Soviet Union. Because immediately after World War II, the Soviet Union was the second country to successfully acquire nuclear technology. They conducted several nuclear tests, indirectly signaling to America that we are not like Japan, who would remain silent in response to us. This was the time when the Cold War was ongoing between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both countries, they ensured that their nuclear weapons were kept in a constant state of readiness against one another, whether the intended attack was planned to originate from land, air, or sea sources. The world was well aware that if either one initiated a nuclear attack, it would result in devastating consequences for all nations involved. If one nation attacks, then the opposing country would retaliate with a nuclear missile and the resulting devastation would be catastrophic. It would be far more horrific than the nuclear attacks on Japan, an event so severe that it was widely believed to change global history, that perhaps 70% of the world's population would be wiped out. To make these attacks even more effective, American and Soviet bomber aircraft were always in the air. Their nuclear submarines also remained hidden from each other in international waters, waiting only for a signal. Additionally, over several decades, the United States government strategically installed its nuclear weapons in the allied nations of Turkey and Italy to significantly enhance their defense capabilities. Because these two countries were NATO allies and were also very close to the Soviet Union's border, this made America's position much stronger. Because from this strategic position, it would be significantly easier to launch a coordinated and effective attack on the western part of the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union had acquired it, they too would have decided to station their nuclear weapons closer to America. For this particular purpose, there was absolutely no better support than the Cuba island, which is strategically located only 200 kilometers southeast of America. At that time, Cuba had a pro-communist government and was not being conceded to by America under any circumstances. In America's view, Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was essentially the cradle of communism. Communism means that all businesses would be under government control and everyone would receive an equal share. In other words, societal divisions based on wealth, such as the rich or poor classes, would not exist, whereas America desired a capitalist economic system to function globally. A sort of free market where anyone can do business and generate their own profit. America wanted to attack Cuba to make it like itself. America also wanted to bring the capitalist system there, but Cuban President Fidel Castro had support from the Soviet Union. Those individuals who were covertly supplying weapons to Cuba were actually conceiving alternative agendas while outwardly presenting themselves as fostering positive and amicable relations with the Cuban nation. At that particular historical moment, Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev effectively forged a secret agreement with President Fidel Castro. In this deal, it was revealed that the Soviet Union would install its intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs) in Cuba. And in return, they would also deter the US from attacking Cuba. But the second advantage was that under this pretext, now Soviet nuclear warheads could easily be deployed in the South American region. No one was even aware of this deal. And the Soviet Union systematically began installing its powerful ICBMs in various carefully selected locations across Cuba in a top secret and highly concealed manner. But this news had turned into a rumor and spread throughout the United States. People became filled with fear and anxiety. The Soviet Union has strategically installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is located merely 200 kilometers away from the state of Florida. During the intense 1962 state election campaign, the White House fabricated all of these misleading reports and successfully convinced the public. It was claimed that all these news reports were baseless, but in the quest to uncover the truth, the US Air Force's a sophisticated spy plane was utilized to capture high-resolution images over the island of Cuba, in which clearly observable military installations and troop movements were thoroughly documented. Ballistic missile facilities were carefully observed, and the detailed photographs were sufficient to provide conclusive proof that the Soviet Union had tightened the blockade against the southeastern part of America. This news struck American President John F. Kennedy like lightning. He made the decision to carry out a series of airstrikes targeting strategic locations in Cuba, actions that provoked significant anger and backlash from the United States, all intended to impart a stern lesson. The plan was to completely destroy the Soviet missile sites with decisive airstrikes initially and then fully execute the subsequent major military operations as necessary. Occupy Cuba, which was long overdue. The American president's plan was essentially akin to starting World War III because attacking Soviet missiles in Cuba was essentially an attack on the Soviet Union, a precursor to Vichy. And in the event that such a situation actually occurs, a nuclear war would likely break out from both sides, resulting in consequences that would then be beyond anyone's control. On the other hand, when the Soviet Union became aware of America's intentions, they braced themselves to retaliate against the attack. As part of this preparation, there was a Soviet B-59 nuclear submarine which was mentioned at the beginning of this video. It was ordered to hide in the depths of the Caribbean Sea near Cuba. The submarine's crew had full authority. In the event that a war breaks out, there is absolutely no necessity to obtain explicit permission from Moscow authorities to launch a nuclear torpedo missile. It had submerged to such a depth that it was hidden from the US Navy's sight, and its radio contact with Moscow had been cut off. Meanwhile, the US Navy became suspicious of a Soviet submarine being in the Caribbean and, by dropping small bombs at that location, gave the submarine a signal to surface and identify themselves. These bombs, thrown by the US Navy as a warning, were actually signaling depth charges. These are anti-submarine weapons that, if near, could also destroy the entire submarine. The captain aboard the Soviet B-59, whose contact with Moscow had already been cut off, understood that perhaps war had been initiated. And now the moment has come to fire the nuclear torpedo missile. Certainly, the crew held full authority, but the nuclear button's activation demanded careful deliberation beforehand. Before pressing, the consent of the 3 officers present in the submarine was very necessary. 2 out of 3 officers were in favor that the torpedo missile should be fired in this situation, whereas 1 senior officer was not in favor of conducting such an attack. Executive Officer Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command aboard the Soviet submarine B-59, ultimately decided to go against the other 2 commanding officers during the highly critical and tense standoff. And amidst this, a debate erupted among the 3 of them. Arkhipov stated that firing a nuclear missile is very risky, while they had no confirmation that the war had started. This debate continued for several minutes, and afterwards it was decided that B-59s should be brought to the surface and contact with Moscow should first be restored to assess the real situation. At the time when all this was happening in the B-59 submarine, the crew took decisive measures to effectively neutralize the increasing tension. A meeting between the Russian and American presidents took place, during which it was decided that the Soviets would withdraw their nuclear missiles from Cuba. But not only on this shirt does America have control over Cuba. This was a deal that was presented in front of the public. But later, it was revealed that America had secretly agreed to withdraw their nuclear missiles from Italy and Turkey as well. This tension, which lasted for 12 days, is known today the world as the Cuban Missile Crisis. During these 12 days, tensions had escalated so much that both countries had sent their nuclear missiles to space. This meant that if we survived and war did not start, then these missiles They might be destroyed in space, and if we did not survive, then these missiles would fulfill their intended purpose directly to their targets and strike. But since this particular crisis had now come to an end, those nuclear missiles were ultimately launched fully into outer space itself. Meanwhile, when the B-59 submarine reached the surface of the Caribbean, they contacted Moscow, upon which they were given the order to return to the Soviet Union. Historians believe that Executive Officer Vasily Arkhipov She is the person in the entire world whose monumental and historic decision is the primary reason why we are alive and actively thriving in the world today. Otherwise, this nuclear war would have been so severe that perhaps the names and existence of humans would not remain in this world. I sincerely hope you all will also generously give this amazing video from shares. Many thanks for your truly loving comments. Looking forward to seeing you in the next fantastic video.